Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into a topic that gets a lot of romanticized hype, but was, in reality, a pretty rough gig. Forget the gleaming armor, the valiant charges, and the damsels in distress. We're stripping away the polish and peering into the gritty, often miserable existence of a medieval knight. You might think it sounds cool to wield a sword and ride into battle, but trust me, you probably wouldn't have survived the first month, let alone enjoyed it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening in, let me know your city and time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture yourself, perhaps, in shining armor, a plume swaying gracefully from your helmet, ready to gallop into a glorious charge, sword held high. You imagine the cheers of the crowd, the respect of your peers, the very essence of chivalry flowing through your veins. This is the chivalric illusion, the shimmering veneer painted by poets and troubadours. The fantastical dream that has, for centuries, captivated imaginations. But peel back that polished surface, and you'll find a reality far less glamorous, far more demanding, and often profoundly unpleasant. Your life as a knight, from its very inception, was not a grand adventure, but a grueling path, paved with hardship and sacrifice. From the moment you're born into a noble family, your fate is largely sealed. There's no escaping the path laid out for you. You are, in essence, a pawn in a much larger game of power, land, and lineage. Your infancy is likely spent within the confines of a fortified castle, a cold, drafty, and often unsanitary environment. Forget soft blankets and heated nurseries. Even the wealthiest families struggled with basic hygiene and comfort by modern standards. You are swaddled in rough linen, fed simple porridges, and constantly exposed to the various ailments that swept through medieval communities. The mortality rate for infants and young children was shockingly high, a constant, unspoken threat hanging over every cradle. Many of your siblings, if you had any, wouldn't even make it past their 5th birthday. As you grow, your play isn't really play at all. It's a subtle, almost imperceptible form of training. Wooden swords replace dolls, and mock skirmishes become your favorite pastime. You're taught to ride almost as soon as you can walk, perched precariously on ponies, developing a bond with horses that will become essential to your very survival. Your days are dictated by the sun and the church bells, a rigid schedule of lessons and chores. You learn the basics of literacy, perhaps Latin if you're fortunate, though many knights remained largely unlettered. More importantly, you learn the codes of conduct, the intricate dance of social hierarchy, and the absolute necessity of obedience to your elders and eventually your lord. Around the tender age of 7, your child's burden truly begins. You are typically sent away from your home, often to the castle of a more powerful lord, to begin your training as a page. This isn't a boarding school or a summer camp, it's an apprenticeship, a form of indentured servitude. You become a living, breathing part of the Lord's household, performing a myriad of duties that are far from heroic. You serve at table, bringing food and drink, clearing trenchers, and enduring the occasional sarcastic remark, or even a physical reprimand from a disgruntled knight or a bored noble. You learn to polish armor, mend clothing, and run messages, a constant flurry of activity from dawn till dusk. Your hands, still small and uncalloused, quickly adapt to tasks that require dexterity and strength. You share a dormitory, likely a cold, sparsely furnished room, with other pages and squires. Privacy is a foreign concept. Disease spreads quickly in such close quarters, and you're constantly exposed to the coughs, sniffles, and fevers of your companions. Personal hygiene is basic, at best. A quick wash in cold water might be your only luxury before bed, and baths are infrequent, often communal affairs. The food, while perhaps plentiful by peasant standards, is often monotonous stews, bread, and ale. Fresh fruit and vegetables are seasonal luxuries. You learn quickly to eat what's put in front of you, without complaint, for hunger is a powerful motivator. Beyond the menial tasks, your true education unfolds. You begin your martial training, first with wooden weapons, mimicking the movements of the knights you observe daily. You learn to handle a sword, a spear, and a shield, your small muscles aching from the repetitive motions. You practice wrestling, running, and jumping, developing the physical endurance that will be vital for a life of warfare. Older squires, sometimes even knights themselves, act as your instructors. Their lessons often punctuated by stern words and the occasional crack of a training stick if your form isn't precise enough. This isn't about fun, it's about discipline, repetition, and forging a body capable of enduring incredible strain. As a page, you also absorb the unwritten rules of courtly life. You observe the interactions between the lord and his vassals, the ladies of the court, and the visiting dignitaries. You learn proper etiquette, how to address those of higher rank, and the subtle art of diplomacy. You listen to the gossip, the political intrigue, and the ever-present whispers of war or alliances. This constant exposure to the inner workings of the noble household prepares you for the strategic and political aspects of your future role, which extend far beyond the battlefield. You learn to be observant, to keep your mouth shut, and to understand the power dynamics that govern your world. Around the age of 14, you graduate from page to squire. This is a significant step, moving you closer to knighthood, but it also intensifies your duties. Your training becomes more rigorous, focusing heavily on martial skills. You now accompany knights into battle, though not yet as a combatant. Your primary role is to assist your knight, carrying his shield, tending to his horse, and providing fresh weapons or water during the chaos of combat. You learn to anticipate his needs, to quickly fetch a fallen sword, or to help him remount if he's unhorsed. This is your first-hand experience of war, a brutal, visceral introduction to the realities of bloodshed and fear. You spend countless hours practicing with real weapons, though blunted, honing your sword fighting, jousting, and archery skills. You endure long, exhausting drills under the scorching sun or in the biting cold. Your body is constantly sore, bruised, and aching. You learn to ride in heavy armor, a skill that demands incredible core strength and balance. You learn to care for your armor, polishing it meticulously to prevent rust, a never-ending chore that keeps your hands perpetually grimy. The price of plate isn't just financial, it's measured in sweat, effort, and the constant threat of injury during training. As a squire, you also gain more responsibility within the castle. You might be entrusted with managing the lord's stables, overseeing hunts, or even acting as a personal attendant to the lady of the castle. These roles further refine your administrative and social skills, preparing you for the multifaceted demands of managing your own lands once you become a knight. You are expected to be courteous, honorable, and disciplined, embodying the ideals of chivalry even before you formally receive the title. Any lapse in judgment or behavior could delay your knighthood or, in severe cases, derail your future entirely. Your diet, while still basic, might improve slightly, but it's still far from luxurious. Meat is more common, but often tough and heavily salted to preserve it. Vegetables are still seasonal, and fresh fruit is a rare treat. Water quality is often suspect, making ale and watered-down wine common beverages, even for children. The taste of boredom, perhaps, is a flavor you become intimately familiar with in your everyday meals. And then there's the constant threat of boredom. Life in a medieval castle, for all its bustle, could also be incredibly monotonous. Long periods between campaigns, endless days of training, and the lack of diverse entertainment meant that routine could become soul-crushing. You might pass the time playing board games, listening to traveling minstrels, or simply staring at the same walls day after day. This isn't the thrilling, adventure-filled existence portrayed in romantic sagas. It's a life defined by duty, discipline, and the ever-present grind. You quickly learn to find small moments of respite, a quiet corner to read, perhaps, or a brief conversation with a fellow squire, anything to break the monotony. As you transition from a bustling page to a more dedicated squire, your days, while still filled with chores, increasingly revolve around the demanding physical and mental preparations for knighthood. You are now the shadow of your knight, a constant presence at his side, observing, learning, and anticipating his every need. This period, typically lasting from your mid-teens into your early 20s, is a crucible, forging the raw material of your youth into something resembling a warrior. Your training intensifies dramatically. Forget the wooden swords of your childhood. You are now wielding blunted steel, the weight and balance of which are far more demanding. You practice endlessly, striking at pell posts, wooden dummies that simulate an opponent, until your arms ache and your muscles scream in protest. You learn to cut, thrust, and parry, developing the muscle memory that will be critical in the chaos of battle. Your instructors, grizzled veterans who have seen countless skirmishes, offer little in the way of encouragement, preferring instead a sharp critique or a swift, stinging blow to correct your form. There is no room for error, no allowance for weakness. Your life and the lives of those you protect will one day depend on your proficiency. Beyond individual combat, you are taught the intricacies of group tactics. You learn to fight in formation, to coordinate with your fellow squires, to understand the importance of a shield wall, and to follow the commands of your superiors without hesitation. You participate in mock battles, sometimes using padded weapons, sometimes just relying on the sheer physicality of wrestling and grappling. These aren't games. They are vital rehearsals for the grim reality of warfare, designed to instill discipline, teamwork, and an unwavering sense of duty. You learn to trust the man next to you, for in battle, your survival may depend as much on his shield as on your own sword. Then there's the horse. For a knight, his horse is not merely a mode of transport. It is an extension of his will, a powerful weapon in its own right. As a squire, you spend hours in the stable, learning to care for these magnificent, yet temperamental creatures. You learn to groom them, to feed them, to spot signs of illness or injury, and to manage their skittish natures. But more importantly, you learn to ride them in full armor, a skill that is far more difficult than it sounds. Imagine strapping on 50 to 70 pounds of steel, then trying to control a powerful animal in a charge, all while wielding a lance or a sword. Your legs ache from gripping the saddle, your back strains under the weight, and your vision is often obscured by your helmet. Beyond the battlefield, your equestrian skills are also vital for hunting, travel, and displaying your status. Jousting, though often romanticized as a courtly sport, is an incredibly dangerous training exercise. You practice with blunted lances, charging at a wooden quintain, a rotating dummy designed to punish imprecise hits. The impact, even with a blunted weapon, is jarring, sending vibrations through your entire body. A miscalculation can unseat you, sending you tumbling to the ground in a cacophony of metal, or worse, result in serious injury. Broken bones, concussions, and dislocated joints are common occurrences. Yet, you endure. For jousting not only hones your horsemanship and accuracy, but also demonstrates your courage and prowess, qualities essential for earning the respect of your peers and your lord. The sheer price of plate is something you feel acutely, not just in terms of your lord's financial burden, but in the physical cost to you, the squire responsible for its upkeep. Each piece of armor, the helm, the gorget, the breastplate, the gauntlets, the greaves, the sabatons must be meticulously cleaned, polished, and maintained. Rust, your constant enemy, can quickly degrade the metal, rendering it less protective. You spend hours applying oil, rubbing away grime, and buffing surfaces until they gleam. This isn't just about aesthetics, it's about functionality. A rusty hinge or a seized buckle can be fatal in battle. You learn to repair minor damage, to hammer out dents, and to replace worn straps and buckles. It's a never-ending chore, ensuring your knight's protection is always at its peak, and by extension, that your own future knighthood is secure. The armor itself is a marvel of medieval engineering, yet it comes with significant drawbacks. While it offers unparalleled protection against blades and arrows, it severely restricts your movement and vision. You are encased in metal, your senses muffled. The clang and clatter of your own movements, amplified by the metal, can make it difficult to hear commands or the approach of an enemy. Your peripheral vision is severely limited, forcing you to constantly turn your head to survey your surroundings. And the weight. Oh, the weight. Every step is a conscious effort. Every swing of your sword an expenditure of immense energy. Imagine trying to run a marathon in a full suit of heavy weights. That's akin to the physical demands of fighting in armor. Beyond the physical toll, there's the constant battle against the elements and the pervasive filth of medieval life, which makes hygiene and hardship constant companions. Even in a grand castle, sanitation is rudimentary at best. Latrines are often open pits, their stench permeating the air. Water for washing is hauled from wells or rivers, often contaminated. Baths are rare luxuries, taken perhaps once a month, if you're fortunate. You share communal tubs, the water growing increasingly murky with each successive bather. The concept of individual hygiene as we understand it simply doesn't exist. You are accustomed to a constant state of mild discomfort itching from fleas, the dull ache of unwashed skin, and the persistent smell of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and damp straw. Your clothing, typically wool and linen, is difficult to clean and holds onto odors. Underneath your armor, layers of padded garments quickly become soaked with sweat, creating a breeding ground for skin infections and chafing. Minor cuts and abrasions, easily acquired during training or daily tasks, can quickly fester into painful, debilitating infections due to the lack of antiseptics and basic medical knowledge. A simple scratch could lead to a life-threatening fever. You learn to ignore the discomfort, to push through the itching and the stiffness, for complaint is seen as weakness. Food preparation, too, is a source of potential illness. Without refrigeration, food spoils quickly. Meat is often heavily salted, spiced, or smoked to preserve it, masking any underlying spoilage. Water, as mentioned, is often unsafe, leading to frequent bouts of dysentery and other gastrointestinal ailments. Historians still debate whether the prevalence of ale and wine in medieval diets was primarily due to cultural preference or a practical necessity to avoid contaminated water sources. Regardless, you are accustomed to a diet that, while perhaps filling, is rarely varied and often contributes to your general ill health. And then there are the pests. Fleas, lice, and rats are ubiquitous. They infest your bedding, your clothing, and the very structure of the castle. You learn to live with the constant itching, the scuttling sounds in the night, and the gnawing fear of the diseases they carry. The Black Death, though occurring later in the medieval period for many, was just one, albeit extreme, example of how quickly disease could decimate a population, often facilitated by the unsanitary conditions that were simply a fact of life. You are, in essence, constantly battling an invisible enemy, a myriad of microscopic threats that can bring you to your knees far more effectively than any enemy knight. Your life as a squire is one of constant exertion and minimal comfort. You are a servant, a student, and a soldier in training, all rolled into one. You perform menial tasks, endure rigorous physical demands, and live in conditions that would make most modern individuals recoil. Yet, you persist, driven by the elusive dream of knighthood, the promise of status, land, and the right to carry a sword in your own name. This dream, though increasingly tarnished by the harsh realities of your daily life, remains the guiding star that pushes you through exhaustion, pain, and the relentless grind of medieval existence. The culmination of your years of training, the moment you have toiled and sweated for, arrives with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. You are finally ready to become a knight. The dubbing ceremony, a moment forever etched in your memory, is steeped in tradition, a blend of religious piety and martial pomp. You spend the night in vigil, alone in a chapel, your armor laid out before the altar, symbolizing your dedication to God and your future Lord. This quiet solitude, a rare luxury, allows you to reflect on your journey, on the sacrifices made, and on the solemn oath you are about to undertake. The next morning, you present yourself, bathed and perhaps shorn of some of your rougher edges. Before your Lord, kneeling, you swear your fealty, an unbreakable bond of loyalty that will define the rest of your life. You pledge to protect the weak, uphold justice, defend the church, and fight bravely for your Lord. This oath is not merely words. It is a sacred vow, a contract with both man and God. Your Lord then taps you on the shoulder with the flat of a sword, uttering the words that transform you, "Be thou a knight." This single touch, this ancient ritual, bestows upon you a new identity, a new purpose, and a lifetime of obligations. But the price of plate extends far beyond the physical toll you've already paid as a squire. Now, as a newly minted knight, you are expected to own your own equipment. This isn't just a sword and shield, it's a full suit of custom-made armor, a war horse, and the necessary accoutrements to maintain them. And let me tell you, this stuff was prohibitively expensive. We're talking about the equivalent of a modern luxury car, if not more. For a good suit of armor, each piece was painstakingly crafted by skilled armorers, often taking months, even years, to complete. The metal had to be of high quality, shaped and tempered to withstand blows, yet light enough to allow for some degree of movement. This wasn't off-the-rack fashion, it was bespoke, tailored to your exact measurements. A second skin of steel. Consider the cost of just one piece of helmet. A fully enclosed, well-crafted helmet, designed to protect your most vital organ, could cost a small fortune. Now multiply that by all the other components: the breastplate, the backplate, the gauntlets, the leg and arm defenses, the chainmail coif underneath. And that's just the armor for you. Your warhorse, known as a destrier, was another significant investment. These were massive, powerful animals, specially bred and trained for combat, capable of carrying a heavily armored knight into the fray. A single destrier could cost more than a dozen ordinary plow horses. You were also responsible for its feed, its stabling, and its veterinary care, which, by medieval standards, was rudimentary at best. So, where does a newly knighted individual, often without vast landholdings or inherited wealth, acquire such riches? The answer often lies in debt. You might receive a grant from your lord, but it's rarely enough to cover everything. More likely, you borrow from moneylenders, from the church, or from wealthier nobles, plunging yourself into a cycle of financial obligation from the very start. Your knighthood, rather than bringing immediate prosperity, often brought immediate debt. You were constantly striving to pay off these loans, to maintain your equipment, and to acquire new, fashionable pieces to demonstrate your status. This financial strain was a perpetual low hum beneath the grand pronouncements of chivalry. And this leads us to the reality beyond the battlefield, where the vast majority of your time was spent. Life as a knight wasn't a constant series of glorious charges and daring rescues. It was, for the most part, a monotonous cycle of duties, responsibilities, and waiting. You were a soldier, yes, but also an administrator, a judge, a landlord, and a constant presence in your lord's court. Your days were structured around a rigorous routine, though it varied depending on whether you were attached to a castle garrison or managing your own small estate. If you were part of the garrison, your days would involve endless drills and training exercises. You'd practice your weapon skills, hone your horsemanship, and participate in mock sieges or defensive maneuvers. Boredom was a constant companion, punctuated by intense periods of activity. You'd stand guard duty for hours, often in inclement weather, peering out from battlements or patrolling cold, damp corridors. You'd oversee the training of squires and pages, imparting the harsh lessons you yourself had learned. You'd participate in the daily religious services, a constant reminder of the church's pervasive influence. Managing your own small estate, if you were fortunate enough to receive one, brought a different set of burdens. You were responsible for the peasants living on your land, collecting rents, administering justice, and ensuring their productivity. This meant dealing with disputes, imposing fines, and resolving conflicts, often without much formal legal training. You were the lowest rung of the feudal ladder, expected to extract resources from your land and your tenants, not just for your own upkeep, but to contribute to your lord's coffers and to raise men for his armies when called upon. It was a constant balancing act between maintaining order, ensuring your own survival, and fulfilling your obligations to your overlord. Hunting was not just a pastime, it was a practical necessity for supplementing your diet and maintaining your martial skills. You'd ride out with your hounds and falcons, tracking game through forests and fields. But even hunting was a laborious affair, requiring skill, patience, and often a substantial retinue of beaters and handlers. It was far from a leisurely stroll. It was a strategic pursuit, honing your tracking abilities and your horsemanship in rough terrain. And then there's the constant travel. Medieval communication was slow, and your presence was often required in various locations. You might spend weeks or even months on the road, accompanying your lord on diplomatic missions, traveling to tournaments, or responding to calls for military service. These journeys were arduous. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks, infested with bandits. Accommodations were scarce and often uncomfortable, offering little respite from the elements. You would sleep in crowded, flea-ridden inns or, more often, camp under the stars. Exposed to the vagaries of weather and the constant threat of ambush. Even when you were at court, life wasn't always a glittering affair. While there might be feasts and celebrations, much of your time would be spent waiting, politicking, and jockeying for favor. Courtly life was a complex web of alliances and rivalries, where a misspoken word could lead to disgrace or worse. You had to master the art of diplomacy, to know when to speak and when to remain silent, to understand the subtle cues of power and influence. It was a constant performance, a strategic game played with words and gestures, where your reputation, and sometimes your life, hung in the balance. Historians still debate whether the focus on courtly love and elaborate social rituals was a genuine expression of refined culture or a carefully constructed mechanism to distract ambitious knights from engaging in too much real-world conflict against their lord. Amidst all this, you were expected to maintain an outward appearance of piety and adherence to the codes of chivalry, while the romantic ideals emphasized bravery, honor, and courtesy. The grim realities of medieval life often forced pragmatic, less than chivalrous decisions. You might be forced to participate in harsh punishments for peasants, to engage in brutal acts of warfare, or to compromise your personal ethics for the sake of your lord's ambitions. The gap between the ideal and the real was a constant, unsettling presence in your life. You were a warrior of God, yet often engaged in actions that seemed anything but divine. Số từ 2600 đang chờ lệnh tiếp tục. 4. Fan phụ. Even with all the rigorous training and the financial burden of equipping yourself, the truth of life as a medieval knight was that you were never truly comfortable. The concept of hygiene and hardship wasn't just a passing inconvenience. It was a constant, pervasive reality that gnawed at your well-being. Imagine, for a moment, a world without running water, without soap as we know it, without flushing toilets, and with little understanding of germ theory. That was your daily existence. Let's start with the most basic necessity: water. While castles often had wells, the water quality was always a gamble. Contamination from animal waste, human sewage, and general runoff was common. Your primary beverage was likely ale or watered-down wine, not just for pleasure, but because the fermentation process made them safer to drink than raw water. Even so, intestinal parasites and dysentery were constant threats, weakening your body and making you susceptible to other illnesses. You were constantly battling an internal enemy that sapped your strength and made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. Bathing was a rare luxury, not a daily ritual. When you did bathe, it was often in a communal wooden tub, the water probably heated over an open fire, shared with several other knights or squires. The water would quickly become murky, a testament to the layers of grime being washed away. Forget fresh towels and scented soaps, you'd dry yourself with rough linen. And your soap might be lye-based, harsh on the skin. The very idea of cleanliness as we understand it simply didn't exist. You lived in a perpetual state of being slightly, or often very, dirty. And the smells. Oh, the smells of a medieval castle. Imagine a symphony of odors, unwashed bodies, stale ale, horse manure from the stable, cooking fires, damp straw from bedding, and the ever-present stench of open latrines. Waste disposal was rudimentary at best. Human and animal waste was often simply thrown into moats or collected in cesspits, creating a pervasive odor that hung heavy in the air. You became accustomed to it, of course, but it was a constant assault on your senses. Your clothing, primarily wool and linen, was difficult to clean. Absorbing these smells and clinging to them even after a rudimentary wash. Underneath your armor, things were even worse. You wore padded undergarments, often made of linen or coarse wool, which quickly became soaked with sweat during training or battle. This sweat, combined with the lack of proper ventilation, created a warm, moist environment perfect for skin infections, chafing, and rashes. Imagine wearing a heavy, non-breathable suit of armor for hours, even days, on end. The itching, the discomfort, the constant dampness against your skin. It was a never-ending torment. And when you finally removed your armor, the relief was palpable. But the lingering stench and discomfort remained. Then there were the pests, fleas, lice, and bedbugs were ubiquitous. They infested your clothing, your bedding, and the very walls of the castle. You scratched constantly, an unconscious habit, trying to alleviate the incessant itching. Rats and mice scurried through the walls and across floors, spreading disease and contaminating food supplies. These aren't just minor annoyances. They were carriers of serious illnesses, contributing to the high rates of fever and infection that plagued medieval society. A simple flea bite could transmit a deadly disease. Consider the common ailments. Fevers, coughs, and colds swept through communities with alarming frequency. Without antibiotics or modern medicine, even a minor infection could escalate into something life-threatening. A cut or scrape, easily acquired during training or in battle, could quickly become infected, leading to gangrene and amputation, or worse, a slow, agonizing death from sepsis. Fractures, dislocations, and severe bruising were par for the course, and treatments were often crude and painful, if available at all. Bone setting without anesthesia or proper sterilization was a brutal affair. Your teeth likely a mess. Medieval diets, heavy in coarse grains and lacking in proper dental hygiene, meant tooth decay, abscesses, and tooth loss were common, causing chronic pain and making eating difficult. Imagine trying to fight with a throbbing toothache or a swollen jaw. Historians still debate whether the average lifespan of a medieval knight was genuinely shorter than that of a common peasant, given the inherent dangers of their profession versus the chronic malnutrition and disease faced by the lower classes. Regardless, the quality of that life, particularly from a health perspective, was undeniably harsh. The very act of wearing armor, while protective, presented its own unique health challenges. Beyond the chafing and skin infections, The immense weight and restrictive nature of the armor could lead to chronic back pain, joint issues, and muscle fatigue. Imagine trying to sleep in your armor during a campaign, or spending hours on horseback. The constant strain on your body took its toll over the years, leaving you with aches and pains that would persist long after your fighting days were over. Even sleep, that most basic human need, was often disturbed. The cold, the damp, the constant itching from pests, the aches and pains from your demanding life, and the ever-present threat of attack meant truly restful sleep was a rarity. You slept on straw mattresses, often shared with others, offering little comfort or support. You learned to sleep lightly, to be ready at a moment's notice. Your senses attuned to any disturbance. This chronic sleep deprivation only exacerbated your overall fatigue and made you more susceptible to illness. In essence, your life was a constant negotiation with discomfort and disease. You developed a high tolerance for pain and unpleasantness. Not because you enjoyed it, but because you had no other choice. This relentless exposure to hardship shaped your resilience, but it also wore down your body and your spirit. The romantic image of the gleaming knight often overlooks the reality of his perpetually itchy, aching, and often ill physical form. You were a warrior, yes, but also a living, breathing testament to the brutal realities of medieval existence. Having survived the relentless assault on your personal hygiene, you are now thrust into the very heart of what defines a knight, the art of war, unromanticized. Forget the duels of honor depicted in epic poems. Medieval combat was a brutal, chaotic, and often utterly terrifying affair, with little room for the individual heroism you might envision. Your first taste of true battle is likely not a glorious charge, but a slow, agonizing wait. You might be part of a siege, huddled outside the walls of a fortified castle, enduring weeks, even months, of miserable conditions. The air is thick with the stench of unwashed men, stale food, and the grim realities of disease spreading rapidly through the camp. You are constantly on edge, listening for the alarm, for the distant clang of a bell that signals a sortie from the besieged fortress, or the dull thud of a trebuchet launching projectiles. Boredom is punctuated by moments of sheer terror. When actual combat erupts, it is rarely the neat, organized affair you might imagine. Imagine a muddy, uneven field, obscured by dust and the smoke of burning homesteads. The ground is churned by thousands of hooves and feet, littered with obstacles and the unfortunate bodies of those who fell early. You are part of a disciplined unit, a wedge of armored cavalry, charging forward. But the moment you collide with the enemy line, all semblance of order shatters. It becomes a maelstrom of flashing steel, grunting men, and screaming horses. Your armor, while offering protection, makes you heavy and cumbersome. Every swing of your sword is an effort, every parry a strain on your muscles. Your vision is limited by your helmet, forcing you to rely on instinct and peripheral awareness. The noise is deafening, the clang of steel on steel, the shouts of commanders, the screams of the wounded, the thundering hooves of horses, and the constant thrum of arrows or crossbow bolts whizzing past. It's a sensory overload that makes rational thought almost impossible. The weapons themselves are designed for maximum destruction. Your sword, while a symbol of your status, is a brutal tool. It's used for cutting, thrusting, and hacking, aiming for gaps in armor, joints, or unprotected areas. Lances, used in the initial charge, shatter on impact, often sending splinters flying. Axes and maces are blunt instruments designed to crush bone and dent armor, inflicting terrible blunt force trauma. You're not looking for a clean, honorable kill. You're looking to incapacitate your opponent as quickly and effectively as possible. There's no concept of fair play. If an enemy falls, you don't offer them a hand up. You might try to capture them for ransom, but just as often, they are dispatched quickly to prevent them from rejoining the fight. Every blow you strike is intended to injure, to maim, to kill. The objective is simple: survive and win. And winning often means inflicting as much damage on the enemy as possible, demoralizing them until they break and flee, One of the most terrifying aspects of medieval combat was the possibility of being unhorsed. If your horse went down, or if you were knocked from the saddle, you were in an incredibly vulnerable position. Imagine being weighed down by 50 pounds of steel, struggling to get back on your feet in thick mud, while armed enemies surround you. The sheer effort to stand, to swing your sword from a disadvantaged position, was immense. Many knights met their end not from a direct blow, but from being trampled by horses, suffocated in the mud, or simply overwhelmed by multiple opponents while on foot. Ransom was a common practice, particularly for knights of noble birth. If you were captured, you hoped your family or lord had the means to pay for your release, but capture was not guaranteed. You might be killed outright, or held in terrible conditions for years, awaiting a ransom that might never come. And even if ransomed, the cost could bankrupt your family, leaving you and them impoverished. This economic aspect of warfare was a constant concern, influencing tactics and individual decisions on the battlefield. And let's not forget the long periods of inactivity between major campaigns. While not technically combat, these lulls were often filled with skirmishes, raids, and punitive expeditions. You might be sent to quell a peasant uprising, to burn a rival lord's crops, or to enforce your lord's will in a rebellious village. These actions, while often necessary for maintaining power and order, were far from the glorious ideals of chivalry. You were an instrument of force, often tasked with brutal duties that tested your moral compass. Siege warfare, a protracted and agonizing affair, also stripped away any illusions of glory. You wouldn't always be on the attacking side, either. Imagine being trapped inside a besieged castle, facing dwindling food supplies, contaminated water, and the constant threat of disease. You'd watch as your comrades starved or succumbed to illness, all while enduring relentless bombardments and the psychological toll of being trapped. The stench of death from unburied bodies outside the walls would permeate the air, a constant reminder of your precarious situation. This drawn-out suffering, far from the quick glory of a pitched battle, was a common reality for knights. A common historical fact often overshadowed by tales of individual heroism is that the majority of medieval battles were won not by a single decisive blow, but by the sheer collective force of a disciplined, well-organized unit. Individual skill mattered, but cohesion and obedience to command were paramount. There was no room for a lone wolf charging into the enemy lines. You fought as part of a larger machine, relying on the shield of the man next to you and providing your own protection for him. Perhaps one of the most overlooked, yet critical aspects of medieval combat was the sheer psychological toll. The constant proximity to death, the screams of the wounded, the pervasive fear, and the visceral reality of killing another human being took a heavy toll. Many knights undoubtedly suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. There was no concept of psychological support, no way to process the horrors you witnessed and participated in. You simply endured, pushing these experiences deep down, hoping they wouldn't break you. Historians still debate whether the chronic violence of the medieval period led to a general desensitization among the warrior class or if the psychological burden manifested in other ways, such as increased piety or periods of extreme melancholy. So, while the image of the knight charging forth, banner waving, remains powerful, the reality was a muddy, bloody, terrifying mess. Your life on the battlefield was dictated by chaos, fear, and the brutal efficiency of medieval weaponry, leaving little space for the romantic notions of chivalry. Beyond the constant threat of violence, your life as a knight was inextricably tied to the land and the fickle hand of nature. Your noble status, your very identity, was founded upon the concept of fealty and famine. You swore unwavering loyalty to your lord, an oath that was supposed to guarantee your place in society, your protection, and your sustenance. But often, that sustenance was precarious, and your stomach frequently wasn't as full as your sense of duty. Food, for the vast majority of medieval society, was a constant concern. Harvests were dependent on the weather, and a bad year, whether from drought or excessive rain, could lead to widespread starvation. As a knight, you might be slightly better off than a peasant, but you were by no means immune. If your lord's land suffered, so did you. If a siege lasted too long, or a campaign stretched on, rations would dwindle for everyone, regardless of rank. Imagine the gnawing hunger that accompanies you for days, even weeks, as you try to perform strenuous physical tasks, whether on campaign or just enduring the daily grind of castle life. Your diet, even in good times, was monotonous and lacked nutritional variety by modern standards. It revolved primarily around grain. Bread and ale were staples, supplemented by whatever meat could be hunted or raised. Vegetables were seasonal and often cooked into bland pottages. Fresh fruit was a rare luxury. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was common, leading to bleeding gums, fatigue, and general weakness. Anemia, due to iron deficiency, was also prevalent, contributing to chronic exhaustion and making you more susceptible to illness. You were often just barely getting by, a stark contrast to the rich feasts depicted in romantic literature. And when famine struck, the situation became desperate. You would witness the suffering of the peasants, your tenants, who were dying of starvation in droves. Their plight would directly impact your own ability to generate revenue from your lands and, by extension, your ability to fulfill your obligations to your lord. You might be forced to make impossible choices, rationing what little food was available, perhaps even resorting to eating animals you wouldn't normally consider, or sending your own men to forage for anything edible, risking encounters with starving brigands. The concept of fealty, while noble in theory, often meant that your lord's problems became your problems. If he decided to go to war, you went with him, regardless of the impact on your own lands or family. If he was in debt, he might demand more from your tenants, or even directly from you, further exacerbating your financial woes and making it harder to provide for yourself and your household. Your loyalty was absolute, but the rewards were often intangible, and the sacrifices very real. Being a knight also meant you were often away from your own lands for extended periods. This left your estate vulnerable to raids from rival lords or even opportunistic bandits. While your peasants might offer some resistance, they relied on your protection. If you were absent, your lands could be plundered, your crops burned, and your tenants killed or driven off. Returning to a devastated estate meant not only financial ruin, but also the grim task of rebuilding. Often with limited resources and demoralized people, this constant anxiety about the security of your home and your dependents was a perpetual weight on your shoulders. You were a warrior, yes, but also a landowner, and your status was tied directly to the productivity of your land. Unlike a modern soldier who receives a regular paycheck, your income was derived from the rents and labor of your tenants. A poor harvest, a plague among your livestock, or a natural disaster could wipe out your annual income, leaving you struggling to maintain your equipment, pay your own retainers, and contribute to your lord's military endeavors. A less common historical fact is that many knights, especially those with smaller landholdings, often had to supplement their income by participating in tournaments for prize money, or by offering their services as mercenaries during periods of peace. The feudal system, for all its structure, was inherently unstable. Your lord might demand military service at a moment's notice, forcing you to drop whatever you were doing and assemble your retainers. This could be incredibly disruptive to your farming cycles, pulling vital labor away from the fields just when it was most needed, further contributing to the risk of future famine. You were constantly juggling your military obligations with the very real need to ensure your own survival and the well-being of those who depended on you. This constant struggle for resources also meant that relationships with your neighbors and even your own relatives could be fraught with tension. Land disputes were common, leading to bitter feuds and localized conflicts that could escalate quickly. You might find yourself locked in a petty war with a neighboring knight over a strip of pasture or a boundary marker, risking your life and resources over what might seem, to modern eyes, a trivial matter. but in a world where land equaled power and survival, no dispute was truly trivial. The reality of your existence meant that while you pledged loyalty to a higher power, your daily life was a relentless battle against hunger, scarcity, and the unpredictable forces of nature and human greed. The gleaming armor and noble titles often masked a grimmer reality, one where your status offered little insulation from the harsh, unyielding conditions that defined medieval life. Historians still debate whether the concept of famine in medieval Europe was primarily due to a lack of agricultural technology or more frequently caused by socio-political factors such as warfare, poor governance, and inadequate distribution systems. Regardless, you experienced its devastating effects firsthand. Amidst the constant grind of training, the looming threat of famine, and the brutal realities of war, another powerful force shaped your life as a knight, the shadow of the church. In medieval Europe, the church was not merely a spiritual institution. It was a pervasive, influential power that touched every aspect of your existence, often controlling your destiny more than your Lord's sword. From your earliest childhood, you were immersed in the teachings of the church. You learned basic prayers, attended daily mass, and were taught that salvation hinged upon piety and adherence to divine law. The fear of eternal damnation was a potent motivator, shaping your actions and your thoughts. Priests and monks were omnipresent, serving as spiritual guides, educators, and chroniclers of your world. Their authority, derived from God himself, often superseded even that of kings and emperors. As a knight, your role was inextricably linked to the church's agenda. You were not just a warrior for your Lord, but a Miles Christi. A soldier of Christ, your sword was meant to defend Christendom, to protect the innocent, and to uphold the tenets of your faith. This spiritual mandate lent a moral weight to your actions, but it also imposed strictures and obligations that profoundly impacted your life. The church dictated much of your moral and ethical framework. You were expected to uphold Christian virtues: charity, humility, justice, and purity. While the realities of medieval life often made these ideals difficult to achieve, the expectation remained. Confession was a regular practice, a means of seeking absolution for your sins, both minor transgressions and the violent acts inherent in your profession. Imagine confessing the brutal realities of battle, the lives you took, the destruction you wrought, and seeking forgiveness for deeds that were, in another context, considered your duty. This constant internal conflict between your role as a warrior and your spiritual obligations was a heavy burden. The church also exerted significant influence over political affairs. Bishops and abbots often held vast lands and commanded their own retinues of knights. They participated in court councils, advised kings, and sometimes even led armies into battle. Papal pronouncements could declare wars, depose rulers, and excommunicate individuals, effectively stripping them of their social standing and access to salvation. If your lord fell out of favor with the church, you, as his sworn vassal, would also face the repercussions, potentially including excommunication yourself. This was a terrifying prospect, as it meant being cut off from the sacraments, from the community, and from the hope of an afterlife. Consider the Crusades. For many knights, these holy wars were the ultimate expression of their spiritual duty. You might be called upon by the Pope to leave your lands, your family, and everything you knew to embark on a perilous journey to the Holy Land. The promise of spiritual absolution and eternal glory was a powerful draw. But the reality was far grimmer: long, arduous marches, disease, starvation, and brutal combat in a foreign land. Many never returned. Their lives sacrificed not for their Lord, but for the distant, abstract cause of Christendom. Those who did return were often scarred, impoverished, and profoundly changed by the experience. Even within Europe, the Church's shadow manifested in various ways. It enforced the truce of God and peace of God, attempts to limit violence during certain periods or against specific groups, such as peasants and clergy. While often difficult to enforce, these decrees still shaped the rhythm of warfare and peace. You might find yourself forbidden from engaging in conflict during holy days or specific seasons, even if it conflicted with your lord's strategic objectives. The church also held a monopoly on education and literacy for much of the medieval period. While some knights were literate, the clergy were the primary custodians of knowledge. This meant that the church's worldview, its interpretations of history and morality, were largely unchallenged. A specific historical fact often underappreciated is the role of monasteries as centers of economic power, holding vast tracts of land and employing numerous peasants and laborers. As a knight, you might often interact with monastic communities, perhaps as a protector or even as a debtor. Furthermore, the church played a critical role in recording history. Monks painstakingly copied manuscripts and chronicled events, often with a distinct theological bias. Your heroic deeds, or indeed your failures, would be interpreted through the lens of divine will. This meant that your legacy, how you would be remembered, was largely at the mercy of monastic scribes, who might choose to emphasize your piety or your sinfulness, rather than simply your martial prowess. For example, historians still debate whether the church's emphasis on pilgrimage was primarily a spiritual exercise or also served as a means to control and direct the energies of a potentially disruptive warrior class, channeling their aggression towards external enemies rather than internal conflicts. Regardless, you, as a knight, were constantly navigating this complex relationship with the church, seeking its blessings, fearing its condemnation, and often feeling the weight of its immense power in your daily life. Your life was a delicate balance between fulfilling your feudal obligations to your lord and adhering to the spiritual demands of the church. You were expected to be a loyal warrior, a pious Christian, and a righteous defender, roles that often presented conflicting demands. The shadow of the church was long and pervasive, stretching from the solemn rituals of your dubbing to the moral compass guiding your actions, and ultimately, to the eternal fate of your soul. You've endured the physical toll of training, the grim reality of combat, the gnawing anxiety of famine, and the pervasive influence of the church. Now, imagine yourself years down the line, your body bearing the scars of countless battles and hard living. The dream of glorious knighthood, once so vivid, has slowly faded into the weary reality of perpetual duty. For a medieval knight, there was truly no retirement plan. Unlike modern professions with pensions and comfortable retirements, your life as a knight was a commitment until death. There was no gold watch, no farewell dinner, no leisurely existence in your golden years. Your obligations to your lord, your family, and your lands continued unabated, even as your body began to betray you. As you aged, the physical demands of knighthood became increasingly arduous. Your joints, worn down by years of carrying heavy armor and enduring brutal impacts, ached constantly. Arthritis, a common affliction in medieval times, would stiffen your fingers, making it harder to grip a sword or lance with the same precision. Old wounds, which had likely never healed properly, would flare up with damp weather or strenuous activity. Imagine the chronic pain, the pervasive discomfort that accompanied your every movement, a constant reminder of the price you paid for your profession. Your eyesight might begin to fail, making it harder to distinguish friend from foe in the chaotic blur of battle. Your reflexes, once lightning fast, would slow, putting you at a greater disadvantage against younger, more agile opponents. The sheer physical stamina required for long campaigns or even daily drills would diminish, leaving you perpetually exhausted. You would feel the frustrating decline of your own prowess, a warrior increasingly ill-suited to the very role that defined his existence. Despite these physical limitations, your responsibilities did not wane. Your lord still expected your military service when called upon, even if you could no longer lead a charge with the same vigor. You might be relegated to defensive duties, manning castle walls, or training younger squires, but the expectation to contribute remained. There was no option to simply lay down your arms and live out your days in quiet comfort. Your life was a perpetual obligation. If you were fortunate enough to have your own small estate, the administrative burdens continued, and perhaps even increased. Managing your lands, collecting rents, and administering justice to your tenants remained your duty. You were still the patriarch, the protector, and the ultimate authority on your property. This meant dealing with peasant disputes, overseeing harvests, and ensuring the continued flow of resources to your lord, even as your own energy waned. The concept of a pension or disability was practically non-existent. If you were severely wounded and rendered incapable of fighting, your fate was often grim. You might be allowed to remain in your lord's household, performing lighter duties, but your status would likely diminish. Without the ability to actively participate in warfare, your value to your lord would decrease, and your influence would wane. You might become a forgotten figure, a shadow of your former self, living out your days in relative obscurity, reliant on the charity of others. Some knights, recognizing their declining abilities, might choose to enter monastic life, seeking spiritual solace and a quieter existence. This was one of the few avenues for retirement, offering a structured environment and spiritual purpose. However, it also meant relinquishing all your worldly possessions and committing to a life of austerity and prayer, a far cry from the life of a warrior you had known. For many, this was a last resort, a final retreat from a world they could no longer actively navigate. And then there was the ever-present financial struggle. Remember the immense price of plate as you aged? Maintaining your armor and warhorse, and supporting your household, became even more challenging. Your lands might not be as productive if you couldn't oversee them directly, or if your health prevented you from active management. Your sons, if you had them, would eventually take over. But until then, the burden remained squarely on your shoulders. You might even find yourself increasingly indebted, forced to sell off small parcels of land or pawn precious belongings just to make ends meet. Perhaps you tried to leverage your experience as a strategist or advisor, becoming a mentor to younger knights. This offered a degree of continued relevance and purpose, but it was still a life of service, not leisure. You would pass on your hard-won knowledge of tactics, horsemanship, and the grim realities of conflict, knowing that your students would soon face the very same hardships you had endured. A specific historical fact often overlooked is that many older knights, unable to actively campaign, still served important roles in castle garrisons, providing invaluable experience in defense and internal security. They might not be leading charges, but their knowledge of siegecraft and defensive tactics was crucial. Historians still debate whether the high mortality rate of knights in their younger years meant that relatively few even reached old age, making the question of retirement moot for many. Regardless, for those who did survive the battlefields and plagues, old age brought not comfort, but continued obligation, diminished returns on their vast efforts, and a fading legacy, often overshadowed by the exploits of younger, more vigorous warriors. You were a knight until your very last breath, serving a system that demanded everything from you, until there was nothing left to give. You have lived a life dictated by the sword, the saddle, and the solemn oaths of fealty and faith. You have known moments of brutal combat and long stretches of crushing monotony. You have battled hunger, disease, and the pervasive discomfort of medieval existence. Now, as your journey nears its end, you face perhaps the most poignant reality of all the unsung end. Your life, full of immense sacrifices and unglamorous hardships, was likely to conclude not in glorious legend, but in obscurity. Your deeds and struggles largely forgotten by the annals of history. The romanticized image of a knight often conjures visions of a grand death on the battlefield, sword in hand, falling valiantly in defense of a noble cause. The reality, for most, was far less dramatic. While many did indeed perish in combat, their deaths were often swift, brutal, and utterly without fanfare. A stray arrow, a crushing blow from a mace, or a fall from your horse in the chaos of a melee could end your life in an instant, your body trampled into the mud, indistinguishable from hundreds of others. There was no time for heroic last words, no appreciative audience for your final stand. You simply ceased to be. But death on the battlefield was not the only, or even the most common, end for a medieval knight. Disease, as we've discussed, was a constant companion. A simple fever, a festering wound, or an outbreak of dysentery could slowly, agonizingly, drain the life from you in your own bed, far from the glory of combat. Imagine succumbing to a debilitating illness, your body racked with pain, your strength failing, while your mind replays the vivid, terrifying memories of battles fought and comrades lost. This quiet, often undignified end was a much more frequent reality than a heroic last stand. Even if you survived the various perils of your profession into old age, your final years were unlikely to be marked by accolades or widespread recognition. The world moved on, focused on the deeds of younger, more vigorous warriors, your personal legacy, if it existed beyond your immediate family and lord, was fragile, often confined to local memory or a brief mention in a monastic chronicle. These chronicles, as we noted, often focused on the grand sweep of events and the actions of kings and great lords, with the individual sacrifices of lesser knights often condensed into anonymous entries. A common historical fact that highlights this anonymity is that countless knights participated in major crusades and battles, yet only a handful of their names and specific deeds are remembered today. The vast majority simply faded into the mists of time, their contributions absorbed into the collective effort of their armies and their class. You were a cog in a much larger machine, essential to its function, but largely interchangeable. Your family, while mourning your passing, would quickly turn their attention to the future. Your eldest son, if you had one, would inherit your lands and your obligations, stepping into the same arduous role you had just vacated. The cycle of service, debt, and hardship would continue, ensuring the continuity of the feudal system, but often at the expense of individual memory. Your widow might remarry to secure her own position or manage the estate until your heir came of age, further diminishing your individual presence. The very concept of widespread fame, as we understand it today, was limited in the medieval period. News traveled slowly, and literacy was not widespread. Your renown might extend to your local region, perhaps a neighboring barony, but rarely much further. Bards and troubadours might sing of heroic deeds, but these were often amalgamations of various exploits, or idealized tales that bore little resemblance to the gritty realities you experienced. Your personal contribution, the blood and sweat you shed, was often subsumed into a generic archetype of the knight. There was no grand monument erected in your honor, no national holiday celebrating your sacrifices. Your grave might be a simple marker in a village churchyard, or even an unmarked burial site on a distant battlefield. Your armor, your most prized possession in life, would likely be passed down to your heir, a functional inheritance rather than a museum piece, to continue its grim purpose. Historians still debate whether the romanticization of knighthood in later periods served to gloss over the brutal realities of the profession, creating a more palatable narrative for the aristocracy and future generations. Regardless, for you, living through it, the romance was a distant whisper compared to the clang of steel, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the gnawing ache of fatigue. So, as you lay down your sword for the last time, whether in the mud of a foreign field, on a cold castle wall, or in a fever-ridden bed, your end was likely quiet, uncelebrated, and ultimately, largely unsung. Your life was a testament to endurance, duty, and sacrifice, a life lived under immense pressure and constant threat. You were a knight, and that meant a life of hardship, often concluding in the quiet oblivion of history. You have journeyed with us through the arduous life of a medieval knight from the moment your path was chosen in childhood, through the relentless training, the crushing financial burdens, the constant battles against filth and disease, the terrifying reality of combat, the ever-present threat of famine, and the pervasive shadow of the church. We've seen how the grand ideals of chivalry often clashed with the grim, unromanticized truths of daily existence, leading to an unsung end for most, a quiet fading into history. Now, as our journey nears its close, let's consider the final chapter of this demanding life. Even if you managed to evade a warrior's death on the battlefield, or a slow demise from disease, the end of your knightly career was rarely one of leisure or comfort. You were inextricably bound by your oaths and your social standing, a servant of the feudal system until your last breath. Perhaps you became an elder statesman, an advisor to your lord, your wisdom valued despite your fading physical prowess. You might have overseen the training of new generations of squires and knights, instilling in them the same harsh lessons you learned, preparing them for the brutal realities that awaited them. This role offered a degree of continued purpose, a way to contribute your hard-won experience. But it was still a life of service, not of personal freedom. Your days might have been spent in the castle halls, presiding over minor disputes, managing logistical challenges, or simply standing as a symbol of your lord's authority. The clang of steel, the shouts of men in training, and the distant sounds of the forge would be constant reminders of the life you once led. A life that continued around you even as your active participation diminished. You would observe the ambitions and struggles of younger knights, perhaps recognizing a younger version of yourself in their eager faces, tempered by the knowledge of the hardships they would inevitably face. The concept of a pension, or a retirement fund, was, as previously noted, largely absent. If you had managed to accumulate any wealth, it would likely be tied to your land or used to support your family and maintain your household. Any savings were precarious, constantly threatened by poor harvests, political instability, or the demands of your lord. You couldn't simply put aside your sword and live off investments. Your very livelihood was intrinsically linked to your ability to command and contribute within the feudal structure. For some, a late-life entry into a monastery offered the closest thing to a retirement. Stripping away your armor and donning a monk's habit was a profound transformation, a symbolic shedding of your warrior identity for a spiritual one. In the quiet cloisters, you might find a measure of peace, a respite from the constant demands of the secular world. You would dedicate your remaining years to prayer, study, and manual labor, reflecting on your past life and seeking solace in faith. This was a path chosen by some, often out of a genuine spiritual calling, but sometimes out of necessity, when the demands of knighthood became too great, or when illness or injury rendered them unable to continue. But even within the monastery walls, you wouldn't entirely escape the past. Your scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. The vivid memories of battle, the faces of fallen comrades, the brutal acts you witnessed and participated in, these would linger, perhaps resurfacing during quiet moments of contemplation or during restless nights. There was no medieval therapy, no formal way to process the trauma of a life lived on the edge of violence. You simply learned to live with it, to compartmentalize it, or to seek solace in the rituals and beliefs of your faith. And for those who didn't take monastic vows, who remained within the secular world, their final days were often marked by a quiet, sometimes poignant, decline. You might become increasingly infirm, your body simply giving out after years of abuse. Your family and retainers would care for you, but your role would shift from active participant to passive observer. The stories of your past exploits might be recounted by others, but your own voice might be weakened by age. Your memories perhaps fragmented. The final resting place for most knights was modest, a simple grave in a local churchyard, perhaps marked by a plain stone or a wooden cross. Only the truly powerful or exceptionally wealthy would receive an elaborate tomb or a place within a grand cathedral. Your legacy, as we discussed, was ephemeral. Your name might be remembered by a few generations, but without extensive written records or monumental architecture, the details of your life, the personal struggles, and the quiet sacrifices would gradually fade. So, as your breath grew shallow and your heart finally stilled, the world around you continued its relentless march. Another knight would take your place, another warrior to bear the heavy armor, and the even heavier burden of medieval life. Your existence, though lived with courage and unwavering duty, was ultimately a single thread in the vast, complex tapestry of medieval history, a life of profound hardship that, for the most part, ended in the quiet anonymity of the past.